The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the central square of Oakhaven as Captain Armand Dulac mounted the makeshift platform, his armor gleaming like a defiant challenge to the poverty surrounding him. Dozens of grimy, weary faces turned towards him, some with barely concealed hatred, others with bitter resignation. The officer smiled disdainfully, savoring every second of his power over these wretched people. Pathetic peasants of Oakhaven! His voice boomed across the square. For generations you've whined about your tax debts, begging for forgiveness like beggars in the capital streets. Today, I offer you a unique opportunity to settle this ancestral shame. He gestured dramatically towards the gloomy horizon. Let one of your women prove to have the courage to cross the Blackwood Swamp to the old watchtower. If she succeeds, I will forgive this miserable village's entire debt. A murmur of horror swept through the crowd. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts. Men lowered their eyes, knowing that no warrior had ever returned from that labyrinth of death. The Blackwood Swamp was an open wound on the earth, where perpetual mist hid unspeakable creatures, and the dead themselves refused to rest. No answer? Armand laughed loudly. As expected from cowards who've been hiding behind excuses for decades, perhaps it's best to accept that you'll never get rid of this debt, and I accept. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through the air like a blade. Everyone turned to see a middle-aged woman emerge from the crowd. Martha walked with firm but unhurried steps, her simple, patched linen dress contrasting with the quiet dignity she radiated. Her brown hair, partly gray, was tied in a modest bun. Her hands, calloused from hard work, did not tremble. Armand examined her with renewed interest, like a predator assessing an unexpected prey. You, a widow who can barely support your sick son? He descended from the platform, circling her with calculated steps. Tell me, woman, what is your full name? Martha. Just Martha. Her voice remained calm, but there was a firmness in it that made some spectators straighten their backs. Just Martha, Armand repeated, savoring each syllable. And what makes you think you can survive where trained warriors have perished? You sew, cook, care for sick children. What skills do you possess that the king's warriors didn't? Martha raised her chin slightly, and for a moment something flashed in her eyes, something ancient and powerful that made Armand instinctively take a step back. Captain, you offered the challenge. I accept your terms. I only need to know, when must I leave? Now. The answer came out more abruptly than Armand intended. There was something about that woman's posture that deeply disturbed him. If you're so eager to die, let it be today. Martha nodded and turned to the crowd. Her eyes met those of her Aunt Ilara, an old, stooped woman who had raised her after her parents' death. Ilara approached, holding a dark wooden staff. Take this, the old woman murmured, pressing the staff into Martha's hands. It was your father's. May it protect you where he can no longer. Martha received the staff as if it were a sacred relic. For a moment her hands trembled, not from fear, but from contained emotion. Long-buried memories began to pulse in her mind like a wounded heart beating again. Papa always said the swamp wasn't an enemy to those who knew how to listen to it. Ancient songs hold power, my little one. They were created when the world was young, and the wild creatures still knew the language of peace. I'll visit Samuel before I leave, Martha announced, referring to her son who had been bedridden for weeks, consumed by a fever that no local healer had been able to break. She crossed the square under the curious gaze of the crowd and entered her small stone house.
Samuel, only 12 years old, was pale as wax, his chapped lips moving in delirium. Martha knelt beside the bed and kissed his burning forehead. "Mama's going to get the money for your treatment," she whispered. "You'll get better, my boy, I promise." When she left the house, she found Armand waiting for her with a predatory smile. "Changed your mind? No one would judge you for—" "I haven't changed my mind." Martha began walking towards the trail leading to the swamp. "Captain, may I ask a question?" "Speak. Why are you so interested in seeing me fail? You've already gotten what you wanted, publicly humiliating Oakhaven. Why are you accompanying me?" Armand hesitated. The truth was that something about that woman intrigued him in a disturbing way. There was a confidence in her movements that defied his logic. How could a simple peasant woman walk towards death with such serenity? "Professional curiosity," he lied. "I want to see exactly where you die." They walked in silence for 2 hours until they reached the edge of the Blackwood swamp. The change in atmosphere was immediate and violent. The air became thick and humid, carrying a sweet, putrid smell. The sunlight seemed to dissolve before touching the muddy ground, creating a perpetual twilight that played tricks on the eyes. Dead trees stood like giant skeletons, their twisted branches forming silhouettes that resembled faces in agony. Martha stopped at the edge and closed her eyes, breathing deeply. When she opened them again, there was a subtle change in her posture, as if a long dormant part of her had awakened. "Captain," she said without turning around, "I recommend you keep your distance. The swamp can be unpredictable with strangers." Before Armand could answer, Martha took her first step into the mud. Her feet found solid spots with an impossible precision. She began to hum softly, an old, melancholic melody that made Armand's hair stand on end. "In the dark waters where time stands still, where ancient spirits dance their will, walks in peace who knows the words, walks secure who trusts in hope's accords." The song echoed through the swamp, and something extraordinary happened. The murky waters around Martha calmed. Creatures that moved in the shadows recoiled. A gigantic serpent that had approached with obvious intentions stopped, swayed its head as if hearing a familiar voice, and slowly slithered away. Armand watched. Then she found the first sign. Half buried in the mud, almost invisible under layers of moss and debris, was a piece of corroded metal. Martha carefully cleaned it and held it up to the filtered light. It was a military brooch, not of any ordinary regiment, but of the Royal Guard from 2 decades ago. Armand recognized the emblem immediately and felt his blood run cold. This was the symbol of the soldiers who had been sent to capture the legendary rebel Eric Valnor, the Swamp Wolf. None of them had ever returned. "Interesting," Martha murmured, turning the brooch between her fingers. "Seems some visitors left souvenirs." She tucked the object into her pouch and continued walking. But now her posture was different, straighter, more alert, as if each step brought her closer to home. The sun began to set, painting the mist in hues of orange and red. Armand realized he was lost. Without Martha, he would never find his way back. This realization filled him with a vulnerability he hadn't felt in years. "Why aren't you afraid?" he shouted as the distance between them grew dangerously large. Martha stopped and turned. For the first time since they entered the swamp, she smiled, a sad, nostalgic smile. "Captain, there are places in the world that are more than just land and water. This swamp, it knows me, because I've been here before. Not as Martha, the widow, but as—" A creature emerged from the black waters to her left, something between a boar and a nightmare with gleaming tusks and eyes that burned like embers. Armand drew his sword, preparing to fight, but Martha simply extended a hand. "Shh, old friend," she whispered, and began to hum again. The creature stopped, sniffed the air, and then lowered its massive head in a kind of reverence before disappearing again into the depths. Armand lowered his sword, trembling. "What? How?" "My father brought me here when I was a child," Martha said simply. "He taught me that the swamp isn't evil, just lonely. The creatures here are ancient, older than the kingdoms of men. They attack because they're afraid, not because they're malicious." "Your father?" Armand felt the pieces begin to fall into place, but refused to accept the obvious conclusion. It was impossible. This simple woman couldn't be. They reached the tower as the moon was high, a partially collapsed stone structure that rose like an accusing finger against the night sky. Martha stopped before the foundations and knelt, running her hands over the ancient stones. "It's still here," she murmured, and Armand heard tears in her voice. "What's here?" he asked, approaching cautiously. Martha rose and stepped aside, revealing what her hands had uncovered. Engraved in the stone, almost erased by time, was a coat of arms, a howling wolf surrounded by ancient runes. Armand's world crumbled. The symbol of the swamp wolf, the personal emblem of Eric Valnor, the greatest enemy the kingdom had ever known. The ghost gorilla who had turned this swamp into his private kingdom and humiliated the royal army for years before mysteriously disappearing. "You're his daughter," Armand whispered, more a statement than a question. Martha turned slowly. Now, in the moonlight, he could clearly see the features he had ignored before. The strong line of her jaw, the intensity of her dark eyes, the way she moved with feline grace even on the most treacherous terrain. "I am," she said, and her voice carried decades of sorrow. "I am Martha Valnor, daughter of Eric Valnor, and this was my home." Dear friends joining us on this exciting journey, if you're feeling the same tension and surprise as I am while writing this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a moment of our incredible narratives. Because believe me, what's to come will stir your emotions even more. Memories flooded Martha like a tide. She remembered being 8, running through the swamp trails hand in hand with her father, learning the ancient secrets he guarded. Eric Valnor wasn't just a rebel, he was a guardian of lost knowledge, a man who understood that certain traditions were more important than any kingdom. "He brought me here for the last time when I was 15, she continued, her eyes fixed on the crest. "It was 1485. The king had discovered our location and sent an army. Papa knew he wouldn't survive this time." "And then?" Armand asked, his voice hoarse. "He sent me away, to Oakhaven, where I could live as an ordinary person. I changed my name, married a good man, tried to forget who I was." She laughed bitterly. But wolf blood doesn't thin easily. Armand wrestled with conflicting emotions. 20 years of military indoctrination told him he should arrest this woman, take her in chains to the capital. But something deeper, more human, whispered that she wasn't an enemy, just a daughter who had lost her father. "Why didn't you kill me?" he asked. "You could have done it at any time. The swamp creatures obey you." "Because I'm not my father," Martha replied. "Eric Valnor fought because he believed the kingdom was corrupt, that the people deserved better. I just want to save my son." A roar echoed from the depths of the swamp, a sound that made them both freeze. It wasn't from any natural creature. It was something older, more terrifying. "What was that?" Armand drew his sword again. Martha looked suddenly alarmed. "It shouldn't be awake. Papa said the guardian only awake when what? When the balance was broken, when too much anger and hatred accumulated in the swamp." She looked directly at Armand. "Your presence here, your hostility, may have disturbed its sleep." The ground began to tremble. Distant waters bubbled and seethed. An ancient, malevolent presence stirred in the depths, angered at being roused. "We need to get out of here," Martha said urgently. "Now." "Wait," Armand caught her arm. "There's something I need to know. Your father, where is he really? Did he die in the last battle?" Martha hesitated, then pointing to a specific section of the tower's foundations. "He's buried there. He died defending this place, not—"
The very environment reacted to the presence of the awakened guardian. "This way!" Martha yelled, taking a path that seemed to lead in the wrong direction. "That's not the way back," Armand protested. "Trust me." And he did. Against all his military instincts, against decades of conditioning, Armand Dulac followed the daughter of his greatest enemy through a labyrinth of death. They ran for hours, always one step ahead of the destruction that followed them. Martha sang constantly now, ancient songs that kept some creatures away and calmed others. Armand found himself learning the melodies, his voice joining hers in an unlikely harmony. When they finally emerged from the swamp, the morning sun was rising. Both collapsed onto the dry grass, gasping and exhausted. Behind them, the swamp had returned to silence, but both knew the balance had been permanently altered. "We've held up our end of the bargain," Martha said as she caught her breath. "Is Oakhaven's debt settled?" Armand studied her for a long moment. The woman before him was no longer the humble peasant he'd first met. She was Martha Valnor, daughter of the Swamp Wolf, keeper of ancient secrets, one of the most extraordinary people he'd ever encountered. "It's settled," he said finally. "But Martha Valnor, what will you do now? When they report my presence here, when they discover who you are?" "I'll take care of my son. I'll help my community. I'll live a simple, honest life." She stood, leaning on her father's staff. "And you, Captain, will you arrest me?" Armand rose too, brushing the mud from his ruined armor. For 20 years, he had served a system that saw enemies everywhere, that responded to fear with violence. Now, for the first time, he understood that true strength came from understanding, not domination. "I don't know what woman I met in the swamp," he said carefully. "Only a courageous peasant woman named Martha who saved her village from an unjust debt." They looked at each other for a moment that seemed to last forever. Then Martha smiled, the first genuinely happy smile he'd seen from her. "Thank you, Captain, for the opportunity and for the lesson." "What lesson?" "That sometimes the greatest enemies can become the best allies. That true courage isn't in dominating, but in protecting. And that some secrets are too sacred to be betrayed." Martha began to walk towards Oakhaven, where Samuel awaited his treatment and a new life lay ahead. Armand watched her go, knowing he had just witnessed something rare and precious, a person who had chosen forgiveness over revenge, protection over retaliation. Martha Valnor had honored her father's legacy not by repeating his mistakes, but by transcending them. She had proven that the blood of a wolf could choose when to roar and when to whisper, when to fight and when to heal. And in the depths of Blackwood Swamp, where ancient spirits guard their eternal secrets, a voice whispered on the wind words of paternal pride. "Well done, my daughter. Well done."